And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a good frontal system pushing into the southwest interior with gusty winds and precipitation extending all the way back into the Aleutians, linking up with the next system here. They'll be tracking northeastward tomorrow with even stronger winds associated with that. Storm force gales, possible hurricane force winds there. High wind warning for the eastern Aleutians for gusts to 80 miles per hour. Be very windy for the Alaska Peninsula as well. Mixed precipitation, mostly in the form of rain behind this warm front, pushing into the southwest interior once again. Otherwise, some snow over the northern interior, kind of drying out from the Brooks Range northward, drying out here for the Panhandle for a pretty good day, leading to a pretty good day on Friday. And otherwise, we've got low pressure up here off the central Arctic coast. That's going to bring possible winter storm warnings into this area up here, and also into the central interior as well. Another warm front here, south to north flow once again, pulling warm air and mostly rain with it up north into south central Alaska, Bristol Bay, heaviest here, Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula area, with the next low center just coming onto the chart. Coastal waters here for the south coast, small craft advisories for tomorrow. West winds 25 knots, and the north coast here, west-southwest winds 20 to 30 knots. South 20 knots for Lynn Canal and south 15 for Stevens Passage. Clear and straight, west winds at 15 knots. And then winds much lighter and more variable here in the inside waters for Friday at about 10 knots with seas down to 2 feet. Northwest winds 15 to 20 knots on the south coast, central coast, west-northwest at 20, and light west breeze at 10 knots for the north coast. Cook Inlet tomorrow, south winds 30 knots, seas 7 to 10 feet. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, southwest winds 35 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound, south at 20, seas 4 feet. And for Friday, Prince William Sound, southeast winds at 20 knots. South to southeast winds at 20 knots also for the eastern North Gulf Coast, and southeast at 25 for the west side. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, southeast winds 35 knots, south at about 30 knots for Kamishak Bay, but gale warnings in the forecast here for southern Cook Inlet for south winds at 35 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, gale warnings, southwest wind 35 knots. Good gales here for the Alaska Peninsula from the south and southwest, 35 to 40 knots with seas anywhere from 10 to 20 feet. And for Bristol Bay, south winds 30 knots, 8-foot seas. And for Friday, kind of a more variable wind pattern here for the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, east to southeast winds at 30 knots. Otherwise, the Bering Sea side, southeast to north winds at 30 knots. Southeast wind 30 knots there for Bristol Bay, and south at 35, so gale warnings for Shelikof Strait, otherwise 30-knot winds from the south for the remainder of Kodiak Island. And for tomorrow, storm warnings here for the eastern Aleutians, south winds 55 knots, seas 12 to 33 feet. Storm warnings also for Adak and Atka, northeast winds at 50 knots, and then winds fall back to gale force here for Amchitka Island, 35 to 45 knots. And northwest 25 from Kiska to Shimia. And for the day Friday, western Aleutians, west winds 20 to 30 knots, and small craft advisories now for Adak and Atka, northwest at 25, and these winds coming down to 30 knots for the eastern Aleutians out of the north and northwest. And for the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, south winds 40 knots tomorrow. Storm warnings for the Pribilof Islands, 50-knot winds out of the south, seas a little over 20 feet. Southwest 34 there for St. Matthew Island, Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound, all looking at a south wind tomorrow at 30 knots. And then for the day Friday, gale warnings here for Norton Sound, south winds 35 knots, 25 knots from the south for St. Lawrence Island, and a south wind at 15 there for the Yukon Delta Coast. Kuskokwim Delta Coast, southwest at 35 knots, St. Matthew Island, southwest 35 knots, and west winds at 20 for the Pribilofs. Up along the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, northeast winds tomorrow at 15 knots, northeast 20 for the central coast, east-northeast winds at 25 knots for the western Arctic coast, and for the Chukchi Sea, east winds 25 knots. And then for the day on Friday, southwest winds 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea, but You can see pretty strong gale force southwesterlies at 45 knots for the western Arctic coast, and that's going to run into an easterly wind at 45 knots here on the central coast, 40 knots falling back to 25 knots over toward Kaktovik Island.